I am so excited to introduce our voting rights panel. Clap. Yes. Applause. We are so lucky right now to have these very, very powerful women here with us. So this is our voting rights panel. It's going to be moderated by the Vice President of Democracy Program at the Brennan Center, Wendy Weiser. We're so fortunate to have her, and I'm going to say a couple of things from her very long and illustrious bio. So she directs the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. She founded and directed the program's Voting Rights and Elections Project, which directs litigation, research, and advocacy efforts to enhance political participation, prevent voter disenfranchisement across the country. She is also an adjunct professor at NYU. She's a frequent public speaker, and you've probably seen her on CBS, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, PBS, all the big ones. And we are lucky to have her here. Before she was at the Brennan Center, she was a senior attorney at the Now Legal Defense and Education Fund. I would like to welcome all of you to the panel led by Wendy Weiser.
It is really such an honor to be here, and this is such an inspiring conference and room full of folks. And I am also just humbled and honored to moderate a panel with these rock star women who are championing voting rights, safeguarding our democracy every day, as I hope everyone in this room will leave this room doing as well. We're not going to give long bios for everyone because there's so much folks have to say. I'm going to just name everyone down the row, and afterwards I refer you to the program for their very extensive and impressive bios. So immediately to my right is Genevieve Nadeau, counsel and head of the Abuse of Power Group at Protect Democracy. To her right, a proud Northeastern alum and a former colleague of mine, Keisha Gaskins-Nathan, who's the program director for the democratic practice in the United States at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. To her right, Selena Stewart, chief counsel and director of advocacy and litigation at the League of Women Voters of the United States. And shortly, in a couple of minutes, we will also be joined by Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan. Folks might have heard that there is an election coming up this year, and that the issue of the election is as much part of what people are voting on and what this election is about, and whether or not the shape of our democracy, whether or not our commitment to our democracy and voting rights, as all of the other issues that affect our lives. And that is a remarkable and concerning fact. And so and it presents a lot of, certainly a lot of risks and threats this year, but also opportunities. And so I'm going to just start by asking each of our panelists to give us just a short prompt to answer what is one thing that you're really concerned about this year for the election, and what's one thing that makes you hopeful? And I'm going to go down. I'll start with Selena and come back. We have one microphone, so we're sharing.
Good morning, everyone. How is everybody today? It is really also hard to follow Juliet because Juliet just made you laugh. So I would ask you to lower your expectations. What I have planned. Okay, so during the election season, I rarely sleep. But I think that this particular election, the things that worry me are the rise in uncommitted voters, particularly among young people, because of all of the things going on. I think the humanitarian crisis that's happening, but also just feeling like there's a lack of response in this country from leaders. And the other thing that I would say is also a concern for me is the misuse of artificial intelligence. I think that that is on the rise. I think that it's been around for a long time, but I think that technology has put it in such a place that it can be large scale, quick, and impactful. And so the misuse of that is very dangerous. But what I'm hopeful for, let's end on a high note. So one of the things that I am hopeful for is that I have seen the resiliency of our country. especially in times of crisis. We saw that for the civil rights movement. We saw that for 9/11. We've seen that during the pandemic. And so I have hope that we are going to continue to be resilient. And there's this quote by Lao Tzu, since so many people talked about being present today. So I thought that this was relevant. But he said, if you're living in the past, you're likely to be depressed. If you're living in the future, you're likely to be anxious. But if you're living in the present, you're likely to be peaceful. And so that's something that I carry with myself to try to maintain and stay in the moment, because this moment right now is all we have. And while it will impact the future, what we do now is the most important contribution that we can make.
So good morning. I'm going to try that again because that was terrible. Good morning. Okay, now I feel I'm amongst friends. Thank you all so much. You know, the one thing that worries me about this particular election is, as serious and important and as consequential as this election is, it feels like it's still the least of our problems. As we sit in when we think about the context that got us here, right? Deep polarization. The quality of our democracy is based largely on your state and zip code of what you experience. Shrinking civil society, domestically and globally, late-stage capitalism, gross inequality, rapidly evolving technology that we think we have in our control, but I'm not fully persuaded. A warming planet where impacts of climate change are outpacing our best predictive modeling. And so these are things, and we're stymied from making progress because of our national inability to address our context and history. And so that's what concerns me kind of the most, is a notion that we're putting so much consequence in this one moment that we're not necessarily thinking about all the things that we bring to the moment and what we're going to carry away from the moment. And the moment matters, it's huge, right? Regardless of outcome, Danielle Allen notes, the stability of a democracy is not dependent upon the winners, but the losers, right? So we know this and we know how important this is. But what makes me hopeful is I think collectively we're seeing, I think, an evolving understanding of the consequential nature of the moment. That we may not agree on what we should do about it, but there is a shared understanding about the consequentiality, and I think it's actually animating people to do something, and I don't know if they've made the decisions about what that is, but I don't know that we're seeing people sit on the side and say, this is not my time to have my voice. So that gives me hope. Thank you.
I feel like I should have asked you to hand me the microphone first. Sorry about that. I'm going to start with what makes me hopeful or optimistic, actually. It's not my normal go-to, but that's where I'm going to start. I think that despite enormous challenges and an election in which the stakes are enormously high, I think we're actually in overall a better place, at least legally speaking, the legal landscape, than we were in the last presidential election. And that's not to minimize any of the challenges that we face or things that have not gone well, but a few different things. And I wish Secretary Benson was here because I think she's a good example of this. In the 2022 elections, we saw a number of statewide races in which election deniers, right, those who sort of cling to the lie that the last election was stolen, were defeated at the ballot box. And instead, now we still have plenty of folks in office, too many, but instead we have in key states like Michigan, people like Secretary Benson, who are committed to upholding the rule of law in a nonpartisan way. I think that's a good thing. And that's true in most of the sort of critical swing states, or whatever you want to call them. And we know from some polling data that actually democracy mattered, at least to a meaningful extent, to voters in 2022. We have a challenge to keep that up, but I think that's something to be hopeful about. We've had some legislative developments. I know we'll talk a lot more about that. I personally worked a lot on a federal law that was updating the statute that governs how we cast and count electoral college votes. I spent years on until the last year or so. It's one of the rare examples of bipartisanship in Congress doing something good for our elections. And so we have a better sort of set of rules of the road for the next presidential election than we did last time. We've seen the Supreme Court do a lot of terrible things. They did one good thing, at least, in terms of rejecting some really extreme election theories. And we have someone who's committed to the rule of law and power. So Donald Trump, whereas last time was sort of controlled many of the levers of government. That is not true now. So I think we have a lot of reasons to be hopeful that this election will, knock on all the wood, go more smoothly. Yeah, knock on. There are many challenges. I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, but I do think there's reasons to be hopeful for that. But there are plenty of things to worry about as well. Like I said, I think the stakes are enormously high. I actually spend a lot of my work now thinking about what's to come in 2025 should the nation choose to elect an autocrat to office or re-elect, as the case may be. And when we think about democracy and authoritarianism, they're not sort of polar ends of the light switch. Authoritarianism happens in a slide, election by election. This particular election is very important, of course. And sort of more narrowly, one of the things I'm worried about is the sort of enormous pressure that election officials and volunteers are facing, threats, harassment, and the like, and we're seeing a lot. Wendy has the statistics, I'm sure she will share, people leaving in droves and just operating under what are unreasonable conditions. And what I think that means is that that puts a lot of pressure on those who are there to run elections. And I worry about things like small mistakes feeding disinformation when in fact, actually our election officials do a fantastic job. So I'm worried about the effects of that enormous pressure that our election infrastructure and the people in it face.
So thank you all. And I'll just add a little bit to this. There's a lot of things I'm worried about in the election this year. And we're going to be walking through each of these things. But what I'm worried about is that they are all something to worry about at once. It is an everything, everywhere, all at once. The level of pressure and stresses on our election system, on our democracy, on our country is a lot at once. And we have really good strategies for building resiliency and pushing back against them, but they all need to be deployed well at once. And which means, and there's a lot of opportunity for something to slip through. And so that's why everybody in this room, everybody on this panel needs to be enlisted in the project of upholding voting rights, our elections, our democracy. So that's sort of on the worry side, and we're gonna walk through those. On the hopeful side, this room is one reason for hope, is that there actually has been a really big growth of a pro-democracy movement, multi-issue, multi-sector, even multi-partisan, that's been driving positive reforms in the states that actually brought us to the brink of almost passing transformative democracy reform and voting rights legislation in Congress just 2 years ago. This is still going on at the same time as all of those threats. So we are at a moment of real threat and real opportunity. And that opportunity and the people that are driving that opportunity is the thing that gives me most hope, and the people on this panel as well. And so I'm going to reorder this a little bit from what I was going to talk about in this, because we're hoping that Jocelyn Benson will join us and talk about some of these topics. So I'm going to start with one of the things that we already heard Senator Warren mention, which is the wave of vote suppression and rollbacks of voting rights that we've seen across the country in recent years. The Brennan Center, the organization I work at, has been tracking this for more than a decade. And we've seen in the last decade, roughly 100 laws in half the country have been put in place, making it harder for eligible citizens to vote. But it has really escalated. And I will say, because 2/3 of those 100 laws that are making it harder, these are like restrictive voter ID laws, challenges to mail voting, rolling back early voting, targeted voting restrictions, targeting methods of voting that communities of color or young people use more frequently, often in very transparent ways. But 2/3 of these restrictions have happened since 2020 alone. And that number, and we're tracking, we have a new report just coming out, like the numbers are staying at that level. So there's a real concerted push to roll back access to voting. And individual lawsuits have proved over time, one by one, that many of these laws are discriminatory, they hurt and targeted communities. They actually have the what many suits have proved are the intended impact of actually making it, reducing participation or making it, or preventing access for voters and communities of color especially, or for young people. But now we also have nationwide evidence of their impact, and my organization also recently put out a study looking over the last decade that showed that the racial disparities in voter participation, what we call the racial turnout gap, has grown consistently since 2012, over the last decade, and actually since the Supreme Court gutted a core provision of the National Voting Rights Act. And the numbers now are really staggering. In the 2020 election, the turnout for voters of color was more than 12 percentage points lower than for white voters, and 2022 was 18 percentage points lower. And so if you translate into absolute numbers, had voters of color voted at the same rate as white voters, we would have seen 9 million more votes cast in 2020 and 14 million more in 2022. So these are staggering. So like vote suppression measures, as it turns out, actually succeed in suppressing votes. This is something that we need to be concerned about. This is wrong. This is un-American. And so that is, that's the backdrop on which a lot of us are doing work. And I'm going to start by turning to Selena, because the League of Women Voters works to mobilize voters, especially voters in targeted groups. And so I'm hoping you can talk about how these attacks on voting are affecting communities on the ground, what you are doing to help, and what it is your take on all the talk this year about voter apathy as well. So that's a lot.
Okay, I'll give it a try. So I think in terms of the mis and disinformation piece, one of the cases that we just filed last month was in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, there was a robocall that sounded like President Trump. I'm sorry. President Biden. God. Just because I hate making mistakes, that's all. There was a call impersonating. Stop, please. Let's just move on. Forget it happened. There was a call impersonating President Biden that said, "Don't worry about the election. I'll be fine. Don't show up on Tuesday." And this was for the primary in January. And it was directed towards thousands of voters, both independent and Democratic voters. And so I was in New Hampshire supporting our league at that time, and we saw it. And fortunately, the news picked it up very quickly, and so people knew. But the league was getting calls. Like, is this correct? It sounds like it's a spoof, et cetera. But that is part of the thing that we do. So often when people have questions about the election, have questions about whether or not something they received is accurate, they're calling folks that they trust and that they know. And so I think that the league is fortunate to be one of those organizations that people trust. And so our lawsuit is unique in that it's combining voting rights laws, consumer protection laws, that's targeting using those mechanisms for mass disinformation. And so it's the first lawsuit of its kind, but the reason why we thought it was so important is because of the technology and what AI can do now, and the ability for it to be, because literally the robocall that was directed towards, I think, 20,000 people was created for $100 in 5 minutes. And so that just lets you know the scale that we're dealing with. And so our lawsuit is asking for nationwide relief, that any bad actor who uses this type of technology targeting consumers relating to the election, that we can immediately step in and put that to bed, and that there will be consequences for doing so. So I think that that's important. I think we have to know about things like that. We also have to know that when mis and disinformation comes out, the most important thing is not to spread it, not to repeat it, not to give it more air. Instead, what we do at the league, and we tell our leagues to do, is put out accurate information. Don't even comment on it, just put out accurate information to combat. Because we have to create an echo chamber of the right information and make the misinformation, disinformation become a whisper, if that makes sense.
All right. Well, Keisha, you support work also to push back on vote suppression and on disinformation. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about that and maybe give some hopeful.
Sure. So one of the things I want to first say is Wendy was very kind when introducing me as her colleague. She's my boss. And in the time I worked for her, worked for the League of Women Voters, did other work, I had the benefit and the honor of being able to say, how are we going to respond to things in time? In the space of philanthropy, I'm obligated to say, we have to keep a forward sight. We have to keep looking forward. And a lot of the things that are happening in the moment, we have to respond to the question, I hope we funded somebody that could do something about this. And many of the folks on the panel and their partners are part of that network and community. And so I can speak a lot to a lot of like who we're able to fund around vote suppression, and the amazing work that's being done to fight back directly at the polls, lawsuits that have been named. But one of the things I'm going to take I'm going to tweak Wendy's characterization as vote suppression as un-American. It's actually very American. Right, it's been going on as long as America has been a country. Access to the ballot, access to the polls, access to the levers of power are persistently and consistently manipulated over time, largely to the benefit of to the detriment of communities of color in this country. And so when we think about how we support questions around vote suppression, we're thinking about what is that context? Where are we trying to shift? And as Wendy notes, the importance of being able to push on levers that have an outsized impact, that are impacting spaces that are most affected, that are in communities that matter, and we know that those communities are targeted, and we are thrilled to be in community with the other folks on this panel who are able to support that work. But I just wanted to lift that up just a little bit, that it is actually a long practice.
Well, thank you. And I'm also delighted that we are joined by Secretary Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary. We've walked through a little bit of what people are worried about and some vote suppression, and we're on we've been hearing a lot about disinformation, right? And people's concerns about lies, misinformation, disinformation amplified by artificial intelligence and other tools, and how that might impact the election. And so maybe that's where I'll start by bringing in Secretary Benson to talk a little bit about what you guys are doing, what you're worried about, how that's impacting the election, what we should be concerned about, and what you guys are doing about that.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be back in Boston and see all of you. I think women and lawyers have a critical role to play to defend democracy in this moment. So I'm excited to connect with all of you and these great panelists on this subject. In Michigan, we know we're at the, we're at the heart, at the ground zero for battles over the future of our democracy, and we have been for a number of years now. And we know those battles take shape, whether they are launched by foreign or domestic bad actors, through the lens of confusing citizens or misinforming them about their rights, and with the goal of not just suppressing the vote, not just discouraging people from voting, not just dividing people, but by creating so much noise and confusion that you cause people to just throw up their hands and give up altogether. And so our charge in Michigan and in any state where citizens are facing these challenges is to empower them to be able to be critical consumers of information and cut through the noise and know and understand when they hear a lie, not only to identify it as such, but also to understand the motivation behind it and to really take that as the message. So if someone's lying to you about your vote, they really just don't want you to vote, right? And so to try to just jump over the whole battle over what's true and what's not, and just take a lie and use it as evidence that someone's a bad actor who doesn't have your best interests in mind. And then we also recognize, building on what we learned in 2020, in addition to crafting that message that is rooted both in truth and facts, but also in trying to parse out and call out the motivation of the lying speaker. We also have trained trusted messengers to be the voice for that information, for both the truthful information and also for the hey, this is what's really going on, call them out information. Those individuals include faith leaders, they include business leaders, they include sports leaders, they include academic leaders, from teachers to principals to college presidents, and everyone in between who can help us speak to those who look to them, who know them to be trusted voices with this information that we need to reach people. And I found that faith leaders have been both the most universally engaged in wanting to do something, and also the most universally trusted in many ways from the communities that look to them. And so that has been a source of inspiration for us to connect with pastors in Detroit, to connect with rabbis in Oakland County, to connect with imams in Dearborn and elsewhere, to give them information and have them share it with the people who they see on a regular basis so that they know and are protected with the truth.
Thank you. We only have one of these. So, before switching gears, I just wanted to emphasize the trusted voices, the importance of every single one of you in this room as well. Like lawyers speak with authority. You speak with authority in your communities, in your families. Disinformation is debunked often, person by person, community by community, by these trusted voices. And I wanted to turn to Genevieve to talk about how your organization is using trusted voices to combat disinformation. This is a vexing and huge problem, and there's an innovative project that you guys have.
We're using a variety of strategies, but one of the things that we are doing, and we actually started this before the last presidential election, is to set up it's a bit of a mouthful. It's the National Task Force on Election Crises. So recognizing how pivotal the last election was going to be, we did a lot of work in advance thinking about what can go wrong. Protect Democracy is very good about like doomsday thinking and what can go wrong. And we thought about what kinds of mechanisms will help both identify what is a crisis, what do we really need to be worried about, what's not, and how do we either prevent or mitigate the crisis. And so we assembled a task force. It is cross-ideological, it is multidisciplinary. There are a couple of folks sitting next to me who are on the task force. So it's a very impressive task force. But it includes folks from the voting and election rights space. It includes people with national security backgrounds, public health backgrounds. When we set up the task force, we had no idea COVID was coming, but luckily we had some folks. It includes Democrats and Republicans and in between, so it has folks like Michael Steele, who ran the Republican Party, as former Secretary of Homeland Security Chertoff. And then it has heads of a variety of civil rights organizations, and so a wide group of folks. And the idea was to bring together these people who come from very different backgrounds and different political ideologies, but can agree on certain things and certain rules of the road and hopefully speak authoritatively from a place of expertise and concern for our democracy. And so the task force has done a variety of things, but that includes just educating the media, who is how many people get their information, and others. And they've done that through just pure education campaigns, leading up to 2020. Spent a lot of time meeting with social media companies. It's a little trickier this time around. That's something we did. And they've continued to do that. And so that is the idea of trusted voices is very much sort of what is animating that. And that task force still exists today and is doing a ton of work. It was sort of out in force during the primaries, and it's going to be doing a lot of work leading up to November as well.
So the disinformation environment is fueling a number of challenges. We talked a little bit about how that's leading to efforts to suppress people's votes, a little bit about how it's sowing disinformation that could actually help tee up efforts to sow doubt about the outcome of an election. But another one of the principal casualties of this disinformation environment that we're in is this now increased climate of political violence that we're talking about. And that was a big theme from earlier today. And I want to turn to that now in the voting space. And we talked a little bit about January 6th. We've seen attacks on members of Congress, on their families, judges. But where we've also seen a resurgence, a new surge of political violence, threats, harassment, and the like are at the people and the people who run our elections and make our elections work. So the Brennan Center, and I'm going to turn first to Secretary Benson, but I wanted to flag that the Brennan Center has been serving local election officials for a couple of years now, cataloging this new trend and surge. We have a new report that just came out yesterday, and we found now that 38% of local election officials across the country, the vast majority of whom are women, report experiencing threats of violence, harassment, and abuse. 54% of them are concerned about the safety of their staff. 28% are concerned about their families being threatened and harassed, and we'll hear soon that these are not idle concerns. This is actually happening. This is what it's like right now to be a patriot and run elections in America today. And this has actually been increasing since 2020. You might think that, oh, things might have calmed down a little bit, but that's what the election officials are all reporting. No, it's gotten worse. It is happening more. And in fact, the numbers have gone up as well. So this is a real threat. So I'm gonna start by turning to Secretary Benson to tell us a little bit. You've been the targets of these threats because of your work, but you're also leading efforts in Michigan and elsewhere and a model for how to address these threats. And so tell us about the bad and the good, what we should be worried about, what we should be doing, and what we should be confident in.
Thank you. Yeah, the threats to election workers are very real and very serious. And we've said in Michigan, as well as elsewhere, we've got to protect the people who protect democracy. And that takes many forms, but it takes, first of all, realizing that the impact of the misinformation and the lies really does manifest itself in these threats against election workers. And so anyone who is spreading lies flagrantly or valiantly about our elections is culpable for the threats that then result to these men and women who are neighbors, friends, family, election workers, and others who spend long hours oftentimes just with not a lot of money and not a little pay just to make sure that people can vote and the votes are counted and that everyone's voice is heard. In Michigan, we have passed laws to make it a specific crime to threaten election workers and are also pushing for future legislation to impose stronger legal consequences for those who would threaten or attack individuals doing their jobs because we know these threats are increasing in our state. We expect them to increase in the years ahead or in the months ahead. But we also know that drawing a clear line in the sand and saying this is against the law, it's a crime, to with enhanced penalties to harass an election worker in their line of duty, and to know that the impact, like oftentimes crimes against individuals that are crimes against organizations or groups, have a impact far beyond the individual who's being threatened, and therefore the work we do to protect those individuals also has an impact and sends a message far beyond the threats itself. It sends a message that we won't tolerate these threats to the people in our democracy or to democracy itself. So we've passed these laws. It's been helpful, and it gives us equipment to go into 2024. We also are going to have text from the polling places where people can text if there's an issue, and we'll send someone right away from law enforcement or elsewhere. And we've been holding tabletop exercises, actually scenario planning, with clerks and law enforcement and poll workers so that they know what to do if and when something occurs during an election or during early voting or even in the months leading up to it for our clerks.
So, what? You can go ahead.
We are so grateful for folks like Secretary Benson and other secretaries of state who are doing efforts like that because our league members are often poll workers, poll observers, and have operations on the ground. And so this affects us directly at the league. And so I don't know if folks are familiar with a situation that happened in 2022 in Arizona where in Maricopa County, which is a pretty large, I think it might still be the largest county in Arizona, they have ballot boxes, right? In most states, some states, you can turn in your ballot via a ballot box. And when they were approaching the ballot boxes in Maricopa County, they were met with armed people who were like, "Are you eligible to vote? Where are you from? Is this your first time voting?" And it's like, whoa, what the hell is happening? What the hell is happening here? But these were league members who encountered some of these folks and immediately called their state president and called the national office, and we filed a lawsuit. We had to because, one, it was days before the election. People were actually walking away from the ballot boxes because people were intimidated, did not feel safe, et cetera. And the court took our case very quickly. There was another, I think, organization that filed as well. But the judge specifically found it very persuasive that league members particularly a man and wife combo who said, my wife had tried to return our ballot earlier that day. She was met with these armed people and she was afraid. She called me immediately and she's like, look, I'm not doing this. You're going to have to do this later. But the fact that she was not comfortable, and we had about 10 members who said, yes, I had this experience. And that is what persuaded the judge to say, absolutely not, and to put a ban on the people who had coordinated this effort. And so we think about things like this all the time, and we know that this is going to continue to come up. This is a part of a larger playbook. And so it's so critical that we are all vigilant about reporting what we see, acknowledging when something doesn't feel right, especially when you're voting, because that's a sacred constitutional right to do so. And so I just encourage people to pay attention, especially as we're heading into this election, particularly with the lens of what could be interpreted or felt as voter intimidation in the form of violence.
Okay, I'm gonna, you can.
So first, I just want to do an off-the-cuff plug. You can join your League of Women Voters, right? So if you, if you haven't, please look into it. It is such an incredibly important organization in the community, and frankly, have been the front line of defense for the right of women's votes in particular since 1920, and remain, I think, one of the front lines in the country today. So from our perspective, we support a number of efforts around responding to increased political extremism, and we're focused on working with organizations slowing and deflecting political violence, and for both the general pre-election period, early voting election, and post-election period. Also supporting election officials through civil society networks, through great organizations like the Chicago-based Center for Technology and Civic Life, who operate nationally and do amazing, amazing work. We also support an organization called Democracy Works, and their work is the voter information program, right? So no one knows what that is, but you do know what it is, because when you type in, where's my polling location, you're using it. And that whole system, and they've been doing amazing work around working with Google, Microsoft, and Anthropic to work with them to point their servers at their correct information for voter information and for voter information guides, because as people started using AI to develop voter guides and other information, we found that the hallucination rate was at 100%. There was always an error about voter information. We're really working hard to deal with that, because we know when there's big disruptions about who votes and who didn't get to vote, and bad information, we know what that's going to mean. As we think about understanding other problems, we also look at questions of othering and belonging at community levels. Faith-based organizations who have been incredibly important in this work, as Secretary Benson already referenced, engaging networks and organizations to prepare for supporting nonviolent responses to attacks, to limit flare-ups, to have defenses at the polls, and to work with other folks, and in some cases where appropriate, engaging with law enforcement. We have a lot of community organizations that do not want to engage with law enforcement at all. And so trying to make sure we're setting up systems, networks, and frameworks that they can be well supported, and also protecting their folks at the polls. And finally, de-radicalization efforts within veteran spaces, and doing work to really elevate the point that violence isn't acceptable, right? We have 25% of Americans right now, across ideology, by the way, not equally distributed, but across ideology, across race, that feel that violence is an appropriate response to maintain and protect our democracy. And we have to make sure that there's a larger portion of folks who not just disagree, but are making it clear that this is not something that we want and will see and tolerate in our communities.
This is a real challenge to our democracy and to voting rights, and the idea of actually the widespread potential risk of political violence cropping up everywhere. And I wanted to note that that there are many, many strategies to actually, that we've already heard about, to actually rein in that potential. And one of the hopeful notes I want to say is that our same survey of local election officials found that more than 90% of them have already put in place significant measures like what you heard Secretary Benson talk about happening in Michigan, to actually create pathways for de-escalation, to protect election workers, to protect voters. We are now seeing new legal tools and lawsuits to make it clear both that perpetrators are going to be held accountable, but also that anybody who is setting up some kind of potential violent confrontation can be met with an immediate legal response, as we heard from the League of Women Voters and Protect Democracy lawsuit in Arizona. These things actually have a real impact in shaping what people do on the ground. I wanted to turn a little bit to Jean-Pierre to talk a little bit more about the accountability work, because I do think that that is a key strategy. We have seen a little bit of a break in the dam where violence is now an acceptable political tool that has not been the case for a very long time. And so one of the strategies has been to make it not acceptable and to make it clear that you can't get away with it. Protect Democracy has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, at Protect Democracy, we spend a lot of time thinking about accountability, both conceptually, what does it mean, and how do you achieve it. And so conceptually, we think of accountability not just as punishment, which is, there's nothing wrong with punishment, that's okay. But we really think about accountability as method of preventing recurrence, right? That's the goal, ultimately, in our view. So there are a variety of ways to do that. We have focused a lot on the events of leading up to and on January 6th, for example, which is a key, obviously, part of American history that we have yet to fully reckon with and see full accountability for. But we're working on it. So Protect Democracy, for example, brought a case called Blassingame. James Blassingame was an officer at the Capitol who was injured during the insurrection. So we represent him and others in a civil lawsuit against President Trump, former President Trump, and others. And this, I don't know if anyone listened to the oral arguments on presidential immunity a week ago. You heard that case mentioned. You heard it mispronounced sometimes, but you heard it mentioned. It's the first time really in a civil lawsuit that, of its kind that a court has said, no, the president can be held liable. There is no immunity for what President Trump is alleged to have done in connection with January 6th. We will see if that holds true in the criminal context, but at least in the civil context. So that is our case that is moving forward. Yet to be determined, what goes on there, but it's an important step forward. At Protect Democracy, we're also spending a lot of time educating journalists and others on the criminal prosecution. Right? Education is key. It's important that the public understand what's happening, why it matters, what's normal and what's not. One of the things that happens when you're sort of seeing a decline into authoritarianism is that the normal order starts to look funny. So you have people like Donald Trump saying, no, you can't prosecute me. That's weaponized justice. You can't do that. When in fact, what you do when people commit crimes is you prosecute them. Right? This is actually the norm. This is the system doing exactly what it should do, but it starts to feel funny in these circumstances. So groups like Protect Democracy and others spend a lot of time really pushing on that. What's normal, what's not? How does the Department of Justice work? What can you expect? How can you decide when it's behaving appropriately and not? I think it's also important not to think about these as separate issues, of course, political violence and disinformation. So you can't think about January 6th just in a vacuum as spontaneous violence. One of the things that fueled it, there's a lot, but one of the things is disinformation and lies about the election that persist today. And so part of accountability is not just those who participated in the events of January 6th, but the spreaders of disinformation that helped to fuel it and other things. And so we have a variety of lawsuits against the spreaders of disinformation. We represent Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, who are the Georgia election workers who were targeted by Rudy Giuliani and Gateway Pundit and others. And those lawsuits are sort of bearing fruit. So like $100 and something million verdict against Rudy Giuliani. We represent a voter named Mark Andrews, who was featured in the Dinesh D'Souza movie, 2000 Mules, where all he was doing was dropping off his ballot at the ballot box, and he found himself portrayed as a ballot mule stuffing ballot boxes. Completely fiction. And it took a real toll on his life, just as the disinformation campaign took a real toll on Ruby and Shay. And so we bring lawsuits like that. We also represent Republicans who are standing up. So we represent Stephen Richer, who has been the target of a disinformation and defamation campaign by Kari Lake in Arizona. So all those things are really important to go after the folks who spread disinformation, in addition to those who engage in violence. So like, what are the results? I think the results are mixed so far, but you've got to think of accountability as a constant effort. It's not, you don't win it in just one lawsuit. We have been, I think, we and others, of course, reasonably successful in the sense that costs are starting to be imposed on people. It's several years later, but we're seeing that happen. We're seeing people lose their law licenses, which is also an important form of accountability. Accountability for the guy at the top is still yet not quite there. And then, the last thing I'll say is that part of accountability is having a shared narrative in the nation. So if the point of accountability is to prevent recurrence, it helps if we can have a shared sense of facts and an understanding of what happened and what went wrong so that we can do a better job at preventing it in the future. And I would say there, too, the results are mixed. I mentioned earlier that the 2022 election gives me some hope in some respects, and that's in part because it did matter. The hearing of the January 6th Select Committee made an impression on enough voters. Voters cared about democracy. And then we were seeing a very close matchup between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So we still have some serious work to do.
So we've been talking about some of the challenges in the voting process, and I want to broaden a little bit. We heard that democracy and voting is one of the #1 issues in the state of our democracy facing voters. Another one, the other one that's up there at the top is abortion. And these are not unlinked issues. We've seen a direct link between efforts to thwart majority rule, rollback of freedoms. Reproductive freedoms, of course, are right at the forefront of that. And more people are beginning to see the link between voting rights, women's rights, reproductive rights, and a whole host of other freedoms. So I wanted to I'm going to go down the aisle. I'll start with Keisha and anyone else that wants to reflect on what are the connections, how they've been playing out. There's been some stuff in Ohio that is also in Florida that might help tell that story. Please comment.
Florida keeps telling a story, doesn't it? So certainly the question of reproductive rights has been at the center, particularly post-Dobbs, and really being a fiercely animating subject. It has been aligned in where we see the most deleterious effects of legislative action are in the same places where we're seeing the greatest amount of vote suppression, shifts in rules, and access to the ballot. So we're seeing a lot of duplication and a lot of mirroring of these kinds of practices in certain areas. The other thing we're also seeing is the response to that has been swift, it has been fierce, it has been strong, and has been effective. When these questions go to the ballot, they win at the ballot. And it doesn't really matter if that state has actually elected representatives who are decidedly anti-choice as a collective legislative body. The people are speaking otherwise. And it's been a really, really important point and important motive to actually say this is going to be an incredible issue. And I'm going to talk a little bit about which states are actually doing what where. I do want to expand the conversation a little bit to just remind ourselves that the misogyny that's involved in this is a very strong motivator and a very central principle as we work together. And it means we have to focus on the effects of shrinking rights of women. And it's clear the misogynist narrative requires a full analysis on gender that includes transgender folks. It is insufficient to look at these trends and look at these numbers and think that only cis women are the ones that are affected and impacted by this. It's simply untrue. There's also a messy entanglement with historical white nationalist tropes about protection of white women in particular, right? Why do we care about the bathrooms, right? Why is that scary? And how are we using those things? And really saying that at the same time, using that same and twisting it to target civil rights, voting rights, divorce, other civil mechanisms that establish safety and autonomy. So these are all questions of fluidity. They're all going to be affected at the ballot box, and I think people are recognizing that and seeing it and standing up around that. So we have 8 states that have successfully passed ballot measures protecting reproductive rights, particularly as it relates to abortion, most recently in Ohio. And we have seen where candidates have made these questions an issue. It has been successful even in certain states, particularly notable in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky. For 2024, these questions will be on the ballot for sure in Florida, and in Maryland, right? We're still gathering signatures in another 5 or 6 states, Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, and South Dakota. And there's another set of states that are doing legislative ballot measures. The big difference, the legislative ballot measures are almost entirely negative and anti-choice. Am I saying that right? No, I'm saying that backwards. The legislative, yes, they are anti-choice. I'm so sorry. No, it's not hard. I just got mixed up. With Hawaii and Washington State being the exception to those rules, where those legislatures have actually advanced pro-choice measures to change the constitutions and have a lot of protections. And if you have a lot of questions about that, the Kaiser Family Foundation has an incredible ballot tracker that's kept up to date, I think, weekly on the evolving status of those questions. But it seems really clear that the questions of women's rights and reproductive rights in particular are driving animation, are driving spaces, and are driving votes. I think one of the other things I want to name very quickly, and I see Wendy's eyes, so I'm going to go fast, is that these notions are not just limited to questions of abortion rights. These are full questions of reproductive autonomy. And I think we've seen that in the weaponization of fetal personhood, particularly as against brown and black women who have chosen to have children and then find themselves in a conundrum between the medical system and the criminal justice system, and how that's showing up. The work of Michelle Goodwin, if you really want to do some great reading on that, is a book called Policing the Womb. If you haven't read it, I really, and she's also starting a center on women, reproductive justice, and families at Georgetown Law that is going to focus on these questions that I think is going to be incredibly important. And again, the other space that we see that reproductive questions end up being a challenge, of course, is in the disability community. Forced sterilization is still the law of the land. 33 states still allow forced sterilization for people with disabilities. 17 for children with disabilities is still legal under the law. And of course, Buck v. Bell, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, is absolutely still the law of the land. So there's a whole set of, as we think about reproductive rights and reproductive justice, that animate this work. And it's my hope that as we think about what this means, it creates an element of solidarity that is cross-racial, right? That thinks about questions that talk about, that are beyond questions of sexual orientation, but really talk about the center of gender, what that means, what do reproductive rights mean. And we're thinking about this in a very expansive way that creates a kind of solidarity that's going to be required for these issues to prevail in November.
Yeah, I'll pass it on first to Secretary Benson to just reflect on the vote and women's rights and how you see that maybe being either an obstacle or a way forward. And same question for you, Slim.
Well, in 2022 in Michigan, we were able to say both that your democracy was on the ballot and also our freedoms and rights are on the ballot. And it was a very concise way of communicating to citizens in a noisy messaging environment what was at stake. And so consistently and repeating your democracy's on the ballot, democracy, our rights and freedoms are on the ballot was both our message, but it was also true. And that we had 2 ballot initiatives, one to implement early voting and expand access to the vote and implement a right to vote in the state of Michigan in our state constitution, along with a ballot initiative that would formalize and protect reproductive freedom in our state constitution. So it was a way to also literally give an opportunity to voters to protect their democracy and protect their reproductive freedoms. And it was very successful. We saw more people vote in that election in 2022 than in any other midterm in history in our state. And in addition to that, we led the nation in youth vote turnout, which was quite remarkable and game-changing. And notably in Michigan, and we're breaking down these numbers even more, but close to 2 million citizens are eligible, are between the ages of 18 and 29 and eligible to participate. Of those, when we led the nation in youth vote turnout in that cohort, 37% participated. That's about 500,000. So just imagine if 1 million more voted and what that would look like. And that's really our message now moving forward, how to develop that sense of power that so many are trying to take away from young people, so many are trying to take away from women, which is a lot of what these measures and these battles are ultimately about, taking away power from the people who have it and need to be able to exercise it in a truly multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy as we are rapidly becoming. And so how do we utilize ballot initiatives in the future, but also how do candidates leverage the real power that exists among young voters, among women voters, among women of color, and help them see that in Michigan we say you're going to choose the next president of the United States, and that's true if you vote in the numbers that you're able to and eligible to. And so the policies and having ballot initiatives that connected that message of power and having power over your democracy and your bodily autonomy and your reproductive freedom, and then coupling that with actual policy initiatives that people could vote on was very successful. Now our challenge is building on that success, because there's still a lot more folks who want to engage and help see their role in our democracy and find a way to do that in the post-ballot initiative era, which frankly all these other states are going to have to do as well after we expect great success in 2024 on those issues. Every time it's been on the ballot, reproductive freedom, it's been successful. But the question is what comes next? How do we define what's next in a way that similarly engages people and keeps them engaged in participating in a process that they need to participate in if they're going to protect their power?
Okay, so I think for the question, what's at stake? I mean, I think in simple terms, it's democracy itself. I really, really, really believe that it's democracy itself. And I'm thinking about I'm channeling my comms folks. They're like, don't scare people asleep. Don't say the things. But I'm going to try. But history is what it is, right? We can't change it. It is what it is. But I think about what I have read and what I've seen in some recent, or this was like 3 or 4 years ago, in documentaries around the Holocaust. And particularly in 1933, when Hitler was elected chancellor. And part of they talked about the propaganda, the newspaper articles that were out at that time. And it's so similar to what we see right now. It's almost like a carbon copy, and it's scary in a lot of ways. But one of the things that they talked about is, fear tactics, get involved. Well, not get involved. That wasn't the message. It was something similar. But he really touted his ability to clean up, get rid of what I say, the swamp. That's the modern term, right? But the people in 1933 didn't realize that was the last democratic election that they would have. And so they were just going along, like, let's try it. Maybe it won't be as bad as what we think it is. And I think we cannot take that for granted. I do think, and I'm not trying to scare people, I'm going to finish this with like some action, but like some positive notions. But I think I don't want us to take democracy for granted. It is something that we have all experienced in this room if you voted at least one time. But I want to make it clear that there are systems and people in this country who want to change that and who want to move to a place where we do not have freedoms. We do not have anything similar to what we have right now. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. We don't need to focus on it, but to acknowledge that could be an outcome. And so earlier, I was asked about apathy, voter apathy. And I'm really careful about how I talk about voter apathy, especially as we talk about people of color, Black voters. Because I think that it's very easy to just say Black voters are apathetic, they're not engaging, they don't see an outcome, or they don't believe in the outcome. But it's so much deeper than that. And there's a really famous study by a group of biologists, famous to biologists, probably not here, but has anyone heard of epigenetics? Okay, so I'm going to tell you this quick story about mice and cherry blossoms. So that's all you need to remember. I read the whole study, but I'm going to make it really easy for you. So there was a study with 50 white mice. No pun intended, the white doesn't matter. They just white mice. And they were put together for this experiment. And the biologists would put in the scent of cherry blossoms or blow that into their cages or whatever. And at the same time, when they noticed that they would smell it, so they would lift their nose, give signals that they were trying to smell what was out, they would shock them. So after time, these mice started to associate the smell of cherry blossoms with trauma. And so after they were sufficiently traumatized, they sent them out to other labs where these mice mated with other mice, had children. I mean, mice, I don't know if they're children. They're mice. They reproduced. This isn't recorded, right? No, seriously. Okay. Okay, but please edit. Anyway, they had progeny, right? They had offspring. And what they noticed is that the offspring, when they blew Cherry Blossom into the cage, they also shrieked or had trauma responses. And so then those mice had more mice, and those mice also had a trauma response. And what they learned from that is that biologically trauma carries. And so when we talk about voters not showing up, I don't think it's just this conscious choice. I think it's so much deeper in that. It can also be biological, the trauma that our ancestors had and that we're carrying with us without even actually experiencing what they experienced. And so we just have to, when I think about apathy, I'm not trying to make it complicated, but I just want us to think a little differently about it because it shows up. It can show up in a variety of ways, and now there's science that shows that it's not just one generational. And if we think about slavery, which was 335 years in this country, and a generation is 25 years, that's almost 25 generations of people who are impacted and carrying trauma that they never experienced directly. And so I just keep that with you. All you have to remember, again, mice and cherry blossoms. And so I'll finish with this. I think that if we're going to control or try to have a role in where we end up, we have to think of democracy in our lives as we know it as the car. And the League is an intergenerational organization, which is a beautiful mess, but it helps us realize a lot of important things. And when we're in this car of democracy, I think you have to make a choice. Where are you going to be seated? Do you want to be in the driver's seat? Do you want to be the passenger? Or do you want to be in the back seat? I personally have my own preference. I want to drive where I'm going. I want to have a say in where my direction and where I end up. And so we have to really think about, like Keisha said, beyond this moment and think about the consequences of what we do in this moment and beyond. Because regardless of whether you vote and how you vote, there will be an outcome. And we are all responsible for what that is.
So I want to now pivot and try to end on some hopeful notes here. And I want to say, we've heard some hopeful things. Yeah, but the flowers go in the opposite direction too. And one of the things that political scientists know and show is that, voting is habit forming. People having a positive experience with the election process, a positive experience of effectuating change, not only effectuate change themselves, but our own at the Brennan Center, our researchers are showing it also effectuates change in the behavior of the other people in their own community. The other thing that political scientists tell us is that actually women are far more likely to be mobilizers of participation, engagement, not just in voting, but in communities. So that is another notch in women's belt. So that is on the positive side, like the more good experiences we can bring, the more we can build the opposite cherry blossom response. And I do want to bring out something that Secretary Benson said about this ballot initiatives in Michigan. Everywhere where democracy has been on the ballot, almost like 99.9% of the time, democracy wins. Almost all the places where reproductive rights has been on the ballot, reproductive rights wins. And in places like Ohio, where they see the connection and try to actually stop the ballot initiative process in order to, or make it much harder to win ballot initiatives in order to be able to thwart both a reproductive rights and a redistricting ballot initiative that are headed onto the ballot for this election, the democracy won there too. People saw through that when mobilized and were able to push back on that. So there is some real hope. And the other hope in what Secretary Benson was mentioning is that transformative ballot initiative, one of two that were passed in Michigan, has now made Michigan one of the leaders in the country in voting rights and access passed by voters. And not all states do that, but we're also seeing, I talked about all the sort of bad vote suppression laws that are passing around the country. we're actually seeing more positive reforms passing. You know, sadly, you just need one hole in the dam for to get flooded, but there's so much more momentum on making access to voting and improving democracy better than there is on the side of tearing it down. And so on that, I'm just going to ask folks to talk a little bit about, like, again, going back to not only what, say something positive that gives you hope, but also what is it that lawyers, law students, community leaders can do to actually be on that positive side of throwing anti-cherry blossoms or improving the system. And I'm going to go down in the reverse direction. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to maybe answer this in like a somewhat non-obvious way. Because I think there are probably a lot of practical things you can do. Thinking about what has helped democracies survive in the past. Our country is actually in a unique place. It's pretty rare in sort of throughout history in other countries when you see democratic decline and authoritarians elected to office. It's pretty rare to see them voted out. So it's pretty amazing that our country did that in 2020. We have an opportunity. It's too bad that we have to sort of face the same choices, but the stakes are very real. And so I think focusing on the stakes of the election, educating ourselves and each other is an important piece of that. And part of what it took in 2020, what it has taken in other countries in recent years to defeat authoritarianism. When I took this job at Protect Democracy, I was like, don't make me say authoritarianism. It's like a tough word. People are going to roll their eyes, but not anymore 5 years later. But what part of what it takes to protect democracy is a broad coalition of people who may disagree on lots of things, but do agree on certain rules of the road. Nonviolent resolution of disputes, the rule of law, that sort of thing. And so when I say educate yourself and talk, I would say educate yourself and talk to people. I think it's really important to have conversations. I think Juliette Kayyem was getting at this a little bit in some of her answers. To talk with your friends and neighbors, including those you disagree with, about the stakes of the election and in personal ways. We've heard some of the ways it's very personal. I think that's something we can all do, and lawyers are particularly good at talking and analyzing. And so that's one of my answers. The other is I've been thinking a lot about the legal profession as a whole and its role. And in some ways, we've seen the best and the worst of the profession in recent years, right? So a lot of the allies behind Donald Trump and the sort of election denial movement have been lawyers. And we're seeing consequences for that, but maybe not quite enough. On the flip side, many of the people who've come to the defense of democracy are lawyers. And so there's a choice to make, but I think it's really important whether you're mentoring younger lawyers or you're teaching them or just holding each other accountable in the way that we go about our everyday practices and lives. Thinking about our role in democracy as lawyers, I think, is really important because we can do a lot of good or we can do a lot of bad. Yep.
I think I'm going to beat this car metaphor a little bit to death, but I like it, and so I'm going to use it. When I think about what we can do, I really think about civil society as sort of the gas and the maintenance of that car. As individuals, oftentimes, we're going to ride in the car, where we're going to sit, what side of the car we're going to be in, but there actually are organized spaces that are actually talking about and maintaining our ability to have these conversations, right? There's organizations like showing up for racial justice and others that actually help us have those conversations. There are actually better ways to talk about these things than not. And getting in community, understanding what that means, how do we talk about that? How do we engage with communities? How do we do that so we have the tools and the skills to actually get out there and do it? Because I do think it's actually a lot to ask somebody. Even to confront someone at a dinner table is tough, let alone in a community space and things like that. How do we actually do that? And I think really engaging in those kinds of discussions. When I think about the amazing work that's been done in Michigan, passing the legislation, I think about groups like We the People Michigan. I think about these places who have done massive organizing across the state in cross-solidarity ways in things we have not seen before that really believe in the concept of a shared fate. And to connect meaningfully with civil society, whether it's through specific action, like volunteering for election protection as pro bono counsel, showing up at the ballots to help those mechanical questions, whether it's joining within community and within space, showing up as a lawyer and a person. We can be both. And I think it's incredibly important to think about where are the spaces and places? I mentioned the league. I remain a proud member of the league and a poll worker. And doing this work and engaging in this way feels incredibly important to me, but also remembering there's an entire ecosystem of people who want to be connected, who want to be engaged. And if you find yourself unable to actually show up with time, if you find yourself unable to show up in place, don't worry, your treasure will also be accepted. So donating to these spaces, donating to this work, making sure that these places are able to function, because individual donors and communities are actually the greatest lifeline for our civil society organizations. And please remember that as well, because that is incredibly important.
Wendy, I promise I'm going to keep this positive. It's all positive. It's all positive. Okay, first, vote, vote, vote. I think we have to vote. And not only for ourselves, I think we should be taking 3 to 5 people with us. We need to be making sure that our sister, our brothers, our nieces, our nephews, our parents are voting. So I think make it a community thing. Make sure everyone in your family and your friend space is voting. For lawyers, I think that there's a lot you can do. You can represent the league if you want to. I have a card if folks are interested. But I also want to thank, really quick, Brennan and Protect Democracy, who are often just fantastic litigation partners for us. They lead our litigation so many times for us. So that is critical. And so I use that as an example. For students, if there's a voting rights clinic on the campus, I would do it just to get some exposure to it. I would also volunteer, or not volunteer, but be an intern. The league has a legal internship program where we allow people to be a part of the action. So helping us file briefs, making you're not making decisions. I don't want to tell you that. But what you are doing is you are in the decision-making room as we are building out our strategy. And so I think that's really important context for law students in particular. And then we're focused on this election, but we also have to talk about why our current system of winner-take-all doesn't work. I don't know that right now is the time to have that robust conversation, but at some point we're going to have the conversation about getting rid of the Electoral College, the racist relic that it is, and also just making sure that we are electing the president by means that really reflects the representative democracy that we all want.
Thanks. So I'll just share 3 quick things I think that you all as women and as lawyers can do over the next year to really lead in democracy. I think the first is really everyone should become an election lawyer, become an expert. You have the skills to do so, but become an expert in elections nationwide and particularly in battleground states, because as the 6 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, will ascend into the spotlight in different ways over the next several months. The more you can be familiar with the rules, and they vary in every state, you can play a role potentially in helping to advise people, or at least clarify what people can expect and what's going on. Some of you may remember, if any of you were active as lawyers in following the 2000 election, we all became like experts in Florida election law suddenly, and recount law, and what a hanging chad was. And so you can kind of get ahead of the game now by really getting a sense of what the rules are for voting in these different states, and thereby identify what you may want to do in any of those states, voluntarily or otherwise, or get a better understanding of even here in the New England area. And of course you have New Hampshire just next door, which is also going to be a critical state, to become familiar with issues there, so that if you can lend a hand as a pro bono attorney or as an advisor, there's great work to do there. We, many secretaries of state, particularly those in these battleground states, we work directly with an organization of lawyers called States United on many legal issues. When we need help, they are also often the ones who will provide legal counsel, and they have in other states as well. So I would encourage you to look at them. They're actually, the executive director of States United is the first partner here in Massachusetts, Joanna Lydgate, and whose partner is the governor, Maura Healey. And so there's a connection to Massachusetts as well. But I know, particularly if you're interested in doing something, that is the organization that has helped us most directly when we're in the legal fight and when we're facing 60-some lawsuits that are headed our way. Secondly, as you equip yourselves with this knowledge, also become voices for truth. Meaning there's going to be a lot of lies and misinformation in the national ecosystem as well as in our states. Use your platforms, use your role, use your influence to push back, even just on social media. There are far more people speaking lies on social media than speaking the truth, and it would be really helpful if there were more folks out there saying, no, that's not true, let me tell you what the truth is. It may feel like you're just sort of screaming into a wind tunnel. It does for all of us, but there's no reason we should cede that ground, especially if we have information to share and we want to. I know every time I post something, it's like this gaggle of zombies like come and just try to get their name known, or their tag, so that they can be attached to something I've said, and then they amplify another. So let's do the same thing and reinforce and support those democracy defenders that are out there trying to do this work. And then finally, I think we all have to just take a moment, as this panel has really laid out quite effectively, and recognize that the next 6 months and really the actions we all take as a country this November will define the future of our country and our democracy. And so we have to be very clear with everyone we know. Do we want to support those who peddle lies and peddle in division and peddle in scare tactics? Or do we want to amplify voices and support leaders on both sides of the aisle that actually speak the truth and try to solve problems and bring people together? The legal system can provide accountability for bad actors, but the political system is the ultimate courtroom. It's the courtroom of all courtrooms. And we have an opportunity as American citizens and as lawyers, but also as voters this year, to really make that case to everyone we know. That if you're upset about or seek legal accountability, seek accountability at the ballot box. For large and small actors who would try to peddle misinformation, lies, and division in order to gain power, don't give them the power of your vote. And encourage others to instead support individuals who are speaking the truth. That's the only way we can really, I believe in this moment, transform and shape leadership in our states and in our country in a way that elevates truthful, productive, meaningful voices on both sides of the aisle that reflect the best of us, as opposed to allowing those who appeal to the worst of us to gain power and use it to further their own causes.
So I get the last word before turning it over to questions to say, first, the most important thing is that you do something. 2024 election, you should keep your eyes laser focused on that. There are so many ways in which you can make a difference as attorneys, as community leaders, as law students, joining a league, becoming a poll worker, doing all of the things that we have, working for election protection, going into the different states and making sure that everyone can vote, defending free and fair elections. That is critical. I also want to suggest that you not stop after 2024. Keep your eye focused on 2025, 2026. We get to this place because we think at the end of an election, phew, and look away, when our system needs to be bolstered. And there are places like we just saw in Michigan where they actually did not look away and they have strengthened their democracy. So we won't have gerrymandering and racist vote suppression measures going into place. We can put those guardrails in place nationally, and we came very close to doing that. We can do that in every single state. There are states like Connecticut that are passing voting rights acts because the Supreme Court has severely weakened the federal Voting Rights Act. We can do this at the state level, but we need to put in place national guardrails, and we need to look ahead so that our democracy is strengthened in the future, and that we're not always having this panel about why are our elections and our voting under threat, but we're actually having a panel to talk about whatever issues that our elections are there to, therefore, for our communities and our lives. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to, I want to first thank our excellent panelists. We're here for some questions now, so I want to open it up if anyone has questions. And somebody, if there's a question in the back, should we be passing?
No, it's fine. They can hear them.
All right.
Just up here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're speaking to a room full of people that couldn't be more on your side and want to help. I want to help you do some very straightforward political organization right now, because I was on the phone to Ohio in the fall of 2020 to my son, recently departed from vote-friendly Massachusetts to vote-hostile Ohio. And I ended up on the phone to Sherrod Brown's office and the state legislators, trying to alert them to the seemingly limitless number of perfectly legal hurdles to voting that were just off their radar screens because they didn't have the manpower or the woman power or the anything power to actually keep eyes on. And there was no system by which the issues, like, for example, the state website claiming that you couldn't register in Ohio without Ohio ID, which you could, but you had to do it on paper. Good luck finding that out. I want to figure out and help you create the system by which, when we see glitches on the ground, they get reported in and then acted upon. And I want to be part of the network. I think we all want to be part of the network that you desperately need to accept these reports, because it's going to take a lot of people to do this so that they get shunted into a central place. So it would be useful to have, at the very minimum, the website for States United, the website for the league that you're discussing, what specifically we should do when we get there, where specifically we should send our money. I don't want to water down the wonderful message that you're delivering to live and breathe democracy. Take your friends to baseball games, talk to people who think differently. That's great and wonderful, and I hope we can all remember that democracy is a way of life. But what specifically should we be doing right this moment to help?
So I'll pass it down. I also want to add one website to that list, which, in addition to all of ours, which is 866ourvote.org. That is the National Election Protection Hotline, which is actually designed to collect a lot of that. I know the league is doing some of that work as well. I'm going to just pass it to Selena, and then also to Secretary Benson.
So yes, nationally, no matter what state you're in, 866-OUR-VOTE, it's led by Lawyers Committee, but there's so many lawyers and organizations that are part of that. There are about 75,000 attorneys on the ground to help people with those exact same issues. And so I would say keep 866-OUR-VOTE in top of mind. For things like, first of all, there are some Secretary of State websites like Secretary Benson's that is probably updated all the time and regularly. That's not the case in a lot of parts of the country. And so I would say that use your resources. If you are not familiar with Vote 411, that is a league-sponsored one-stop shop for voting. You can find out who's on your ballot. You can find out in
4, or is it votes?
Vote 411.
Number 4.
The number 4, like emergency 411. And so if you go there, we on election day and leading up to it, so anytime there's an election going on, whether it's early voting period, on election day, if there are things happening, like a poll location is closed, we will post that on the website. This location is closed. For this season, we also have a crisis alert. It's not called that on the website. I'm just saying what it is. But it says things like there's an active robocall in your state. Disregard any robocalls, continue to vote. And so we are posting that information in the moment. So we have 50 employees who cover every single state. We have 50 state leagues, 50 plus DC, and 7.
What do you want us to do? Tell us.
Go to Vote 411, call 866-OUR-VOTE.
Okay.
And you can volunteer online in those places.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so.
We'll take one more.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And I have a question probably for Secretary Benson, but anyone could answer. How do you feel about local municipalities that allow 16 and 17-year-old kids to vote in some select local elections? Is that a way to educate early and instill a habit? So I know growing up that it didn't occur to me not to vote. So I think that's early engagement is important, but I'd love your perspective.
I think we have another question here, the one in black.
Oh,
yes. Yeah, we can take that one at the same time.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm actually Miss Olam. And as an Arab American, I'm not particularly excited about the election cycle coming up. What do you say to like a lot of voters like me that find it difficult kind of to, it's like, what's the alternative, right? Like voting for Biden or not voting at all, because I don't think Trump, for obvious reasons, is gonna get my vote. But is there anything that you do in your line of work every day to make it easier for new candidates that, you know, are not maybe not excited about this, like Biden or Trump kind of scenario? Those two.
So I go around the state of Michigan and I talk to young voters of all backgrounds who always have some question. I don't like this Senate candidate, or I don't like this gubernatorial candidate. And so what do? The thing to know about voting is that it's much more than just voting for one person, although that is significant. Voting is your way of showing up and saying, I have power and you have to listen to me. If you don't vote, you're also sending a message that you're not going to use the most powerful weapon and tool we have in a democracy to hold elected officials accountable and to seek to ensure they listen to your voice now and in the future. So I think we have to see voting as more than just voting for one person or not. It's about making a statement that you're here and that you're active and that you have power that must be respected. To the question about young people, we recently enacted a law to allow for the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. That means, and we also have automatic voter registration. That means when an individual comes to my office to get a driver's license, I also oversee the DMV. It makes me very popular. They get their driver's license, and if they're eligible to vote when they turn 18, they will be pre-registered at that moment at 16 so that they can become part of the system and then subsequently get information about voting and be a part of voting when they're 18 and be able to vote when they're 18. So I'm a big believer in data and making data-driven decisions, and what we've seen in Michigan is when you follow the data of what mobilizes young people, it's removing the barrier of registration and then making it easier for folks to vote from home, through the mail, in person early, and we're setting up early voting sites on college campuses and other things. But also having young people reach out to them and talk to them directly about their power. It amazes me that in Michigan, the majority of the electorate is under the age of 39. And they don't realize that if they all voted, they could change the course of the election. And yet, instead, they're voting at lower numbers, and therefore others can determine the outcome of the election on their behalf and send the message, you should listen to us first, as opposed to those young people, and that creates this cycle of neglect. But yeah, we're excited in Michigan to see these policies actually move the needle. And I'll end by saying we had Election Day registration. We implemented it in 2019. And immediately in every election, the vast majority of people who use it are 18 and 19 years old, like 75%. And so the registration piece is key to getting folks in who are eligible and participating and then making them lifelong voters.
That's great. So can I just respond really quickly? So I think to respond, I think the 16, 17-year-olds, but when we think about the notion of, when we think about civil society, there's a whole lot of folks that are looking to change the systems fundamentally. It is very difficult to look at what's happening with our environment, with all the issues that are in front of us, and to say either one of the parties are actually representing the needs for the future. As millennials and Zeds and alphas look at the opportunities that are in front of them, what does that look like? And one of the things that I've heard from a lot of our civil society groups is this isn't necessarily about electing a champion. It's about choosing your opposition to the fights that will continue to come. That this is not, that tomorrow is not the end of it, but it is a meaningful contextual difference. It is not just, I'll be honest, if I hear it's all the same again, my head's gonna, it's not a question of it being the same. There are meaningful differences in the context that will be created for the foreseeable future, depending on the outcome of this next and upcoming election. And the ability to make that choice to step into your own power and decide what is the shape and scope of the battle we are going to fight, who is the opposition, who are our friends, who is movable, what is possible, is incredibly important analysis that each one of us has to do. and decide for ourselves how we're going to enter that race. And if that means having to leave the top of the ticket blank, that is your decision. But there's a whole lot of other stuff going all the way down that ballot, going Congress, looking at your local elections. There are so many things up that are about stepping into power. And I think that is probably the most important thing, that this is failing to vote is an abdication of power. When we say you're voting, you're not giving your vote to anyone. You're establishing a method of power that you invest in over time, right? No one expects to become a lawyer after going to school for one day. No one expects to have retirement after saving $5. What voting does is an investment in power when you do it regularly over time to recognize that constituency in the spaces where you operate matter. And so that's kind of the way I think about it, that it isn't just a question of this moment, this person, this party, this thing, but it's actually about what's the power we're trying to exercise to deeply reform the systems and structures that are definitely not serving most of Americans today.
Thank you to my panelists. Thank you.
Don't abdicate your power. A fantastic panel. We're so thrilled to have all of you with us today.